Man Talk, Leroy Marc on Trans Africa Radio.
Top of the hour, I have my hashtag Man Talk guest in the studio. His name is Eromo.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about your surname. We need to get the surname right.
Egbejule.
Egbejule.
Some depth.
Egbejule.
Yes.
See, now we're getting there somewhere. And he is a Lagos-based journalist. So
Yep.
you and I share that kind of commonality. Covering West Africa. You write for Arts and Culture Conflict. You had you work in wonderful places like The Guardian, The Washington Post, Forbes Africa. So you're quite a lauded journalist.
Loaded, like I have a lot of money.
Yeah, no. Loaded like.
Okay.
Maybe you are loaded.
No. Not yet.
You know the plight of journalists is that we will always be poor, but we love our craft, don't we?
Mm-hmm. And we don't have influential friends like the Guptas.
He's going right into it. So let's start off then with people like the Guptas, right? You cover the whole idea of you cover news in the Pan-African space.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting because we are fed on a daily basis news from, abroad, from outside of the continent, and people know more about the Kardashians than they do about, say, Mugabe, right? So you are sitting in this space and all this news is coming in. Why did you get into such a heavily sort of sidelined area of journalism? Because it is not the most glamorous necessarily, but it is also not in the most glamorous region.
So the thing is this, right? And the primary reason why Western media seems to have a stronghold within Africa is because they're strong media institutions that are built independently of political patronage and of, they have different revenue models that we've not even begun to scratch here in Africa.
Yeah.
Right? And so what this means is that they control the narrative, and then most of our stories are told from a slightly biased perspective, either because of ignorance or a deliberate agenda that's been set, right? So for me and for, several other journalists who are towing that path, it's a question of telling our own stories ourselves, right, and ensuring that there is a predominantly there's a context, right? There's a background, that the cultural background, the socio-political background, for example, is ingrained in these stories that we write. So think of it as bridging the gap.
Yeah. Well, I've always thought about investigative journalism as sort of tantamount to like FBI work, right? So you are literally putting your hands out there and saying, listen, I'm going to be a target, because it's very difficult for you to work in that space and not ruffle a few feathers. By very definition, journalism is there to reflect a mirror in society, and sometimes the image is not very nice.
Yeah.
Right? And especially in a landscape like Africa, because, we still have many nations that are under dictatorship. We're now dealing with what I call the Mugabe Spring. That's happening in Zimbabwe, just north of here. Is it really as hectic as we think it is? Is there any will for people to get into the industry, just from a safety point of view, especially considering the political narrative on the continent?
Journalists these days, it seems like something that you watch only in the movies.
Yeah.
But journalists taking extreme measures. But I think I'm going to talk right now about the example of probably the best investigative journalist in Africa.
Yeah.
Who's in South Africa right now? Is this Ghanaian guy called Anas.
Okay.
Right? So Anas at some point his work was so good that the president of Ghana, called him, right, to help investigate the judiciary. And he delivered.
Wow.
Yeah. He found about 5 or so corrupt judges, right? Got them on video. He's lived in a mental institution for a few months, doing investigation, right? But he can't go around with his bare face, right? So he has stuff covering his face, right? That's something that he has to live with for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And that's he's almost the best, probably the best in Africa right now, right? So, so he has to take extra measures. People don't know his real face. He has to sleep in different rooms in different countries, within the space of months.
Like pseudonyms.
Yes, he's done a lot of work with Al Jazeera independently. I think the last time, he found out one of his stories made the government sack a minister because of corruption in the ports.
But why bother with all of that when you can get in, cover nice stories that aren't as risky? Because again, it is, unfortunately as a journalist, you can't extricate yourself from your work. You are a journalist, therefore he has to wear a mask every day.
Yeah.
Whereas when I leave radio and I get into the car and I drive home, there's no one, who's sort of following me around, and I can sleep safely at night.
The thing is, with this sort of stories, right? The nice stories, so to speak, they're good, positive stories are good, but you need to realize that the impact of, for example, because in investigation, you're unraveling what people want to stay covered and underneath the ground.
Yeah.
Right? So with these, with these stories, they have a much more larger and more saturated is not the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
A much more comprehensive impact, right, on the rest of us, right? So even you who's on radio, even the guy who's on the 9 Stories, if the government decides, hey, let's hand this contract for electricity, instead of giving it to Eskom, let's give it to the Guptas, right?
I love how he keeps going back to the Guptas.
I just got this book, so.
Are you reading the Prisoners Keepers?
Jacques, yes. The first 3 pages alone are explosive.
In the first chapter, I started looking out my window very apprehensively, thinking there were spies in my yard. Yeah.
So that is going to affect you, right? You won't be able to come to work on time because you had to find a generator, to press your clothes.
Yeah.
Or you had, maybe as you're doing your work, you'll be distracted by having to charge your phone because when you go home, there's no power.
Yeah.
And this is just on the surface effects, right? There's going to be top to bottom impact of many of these things on the people.
Yeah.
So it's important that they do these investigations, right? Smuggling routes, for example, if the big cabals or cronies of, say, the same family, right? If they're pushing these routes, right? The increased supply or reduced supply means that this will affect the economy. Food prices will rise up. There's just a wholesome impact on much more people than these 9 Stories, as good as they sound.
I'm fascinated about that because we'll move into sort of when we sort of condense the topic for the day being the evolution of arts and culture and journalism in the digital age, especially on the continent. But for me, it's quite interesting to look at the things that are currently going on right now because we in South Africa have a very comprehensive constitution that protects media freedom as jealously almost as the right to life. Journalists don't need to reveal their sources. You cannot be detained. Defamation of character lawsuits are very, very
hard. And the
hard.
government adheres to that?
Well, because as far as we know, no one's ever gone that route. But again, people will say that, yes, we don't know of all the other things that have happened. People who've been shut up, who've been, paid off to keep quiet because unfortunately it is a risk. Mm-hmm. And with the words like state capture flying around right now, we actually don't know who to trust because some say that some of the publications themselves are captured. Look at ANN7, which is a local
station,
news station right here, which seemed to be, of course, part of the prelature of that family we're talking about, and therefore continuing the narrative that sits there. So, are those journalists credible? Are those journalists able to tell us the truth? And whereas, literally, if you flick 2 channels down, you're on ENCA, which seems to be the more impartial of them. But again, that business is owned by white people, and there's an issue there about white monopoly capital. So the agendas are flying around all the time, and we're not sure. We really cannot be sure, but we assume so because the Constitution says it's
okay, so
safe.
The thing about press freedom and evolution of journalism and generally boxing journalists is that because he who pays the piper takes the tune, right? So for example, ENCA can still manage to do what it does because it's very strong on mobile journalism, as far as I remember. And the thing with mobile journalism, digital journalism, is that more and more people are becoming journalists, right?
Yeah.
So they're citizen journalists, and what this means is that with little or no training, people can actually reveal the truth.
Yeah.
And this has put so social media in a way is also acting as watchdog for the people.
Absolutely.
Right, protecting journalists as well, because I remember there have been campaigns in Nigeria, hashtag campaigns, to free journalists, right?
Yeah.
And all going viral from Twitter, right? There've been petitions, there've been like small, really minute impact on government policy, right? And so even though social media and citizen journalism also has impact on the scourge of fake news, right? But what this means is that governments, right, who are trying to shackle the press, can I use digital journalism to kind of try and say, oh, there's fake news, right? So we should hate speech. There's something in Nigeria that's buzzing now, hate speech on social media, and try and shackle journalists and all. So it's a weird dynamic between all of these.
Because a few months, if not a year ago, Zimbabwe had a huge clampdown on that idea of digital. I think there was a march.
They have a minister of WhatsApp or something.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah. Listen, and I flew to Ethiopia recently, and everything worked: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, but WhatsApp. I could not WhatsApp anyone until I got to the hotel, because the hotel is an international chain, so it doesn't necessarily adhere to, but literally as I walk through the gates of the property, which for me then comes back to that idea that, if you've got something like ENCA, which relies heavily on this mobile journalism, it also means that then there is going to be fake news, but it also means that the penetration is even bigger, because now a video pops out in a boardroom meeting with you and I, and where we're discussing scandals of a very serious nature, and it lands up on Twitter, and boom. I mean, for instance, in South Africa this past week, we had the sentencing of our Deputy Minister of, I don't know what department he is, Mdumanana, and I think social development, if I'm not mistaken. And he was caught because someone recorded him altercating these patrons.
There was also something similar like that. So I was in Sierra Leone in September.
Yeah.
And there's something similar like that. A minister and his deputy minister were quarreling and trading insults, and talking about one government policy, political patronage, right? And that video leaked, right? WhatsApp, because of WhatsApp, right? And I mean, you know how African parents, mothers and fathers, they worship WhatsApp.
Yeah.
They worship it, right? So that video leaked, and next thing the president had to fire them, right? So social media, and the integration, by traditional media houses is also acting as a watchdog, right? It's helping the media houses get the news faster, spread the news faster, boycotts the channels that the government would normally be able to cripple. And then again, it's also, if anything goes wrong, right, there's also the fact that these campaigns can help raise awareness.
I mean, especially now when we're sitting down with the march that happened in Zimbabwe today, for me being sort of the most current issue that we're dealing with right now. Some are calling it a coup d'etat, some are saying that it is a simulated coup, a pseudo coup, and some have said because of the digital nature of the coup-ness of it all, we don't need to necessarily have people coming in their droves to ask the president in the middle of the night in burning flames. You can mobilize masses of people, which I saw the photo today and I was in awe because it looks like Casper Nyovest wants to fill up FNB, fill up Zimbabwe. What's going down? It was completely, as far as the eye can see, there were people who were there. Now, I don't know how, again, genuine the photo is because you can Photoshop, right?
Yes.
But again, it seems that there's a mass mobilization over there. So what are the governments then, with the exposure? I mean, if we look at things like traditional media where there's gag orders, there's cease and desist orders, like with the book you're reading right now, which unfortunately failed because it was circulated on WhatsApp so quickly. I mean, I received 3 copies of it on WhatsApp because people know of my news interest.
Like whole copies of
like full copies of the
oh wow,
and not the manuscript of the
ebook.
I'll call it the ebook, because with the cover art and all of that. And the only reason I didn't read it was because I'm an artist and artists need to get paid. But for me, the government then is losing their grip on being able to navigate the huge stratosphere. So let's move on to our next question then. So we're sitting down and we're journalists and we're trying to put stories together, and there's been massive leaks of these news, right? We had the Panama Papers not so long ago.
Yes,
we have one
Paradise
now,
Papers.
the Paradise Papers right now. But seemingly,
where Nelson Mandela is kind of implicated.
Yes, and so is the Queen.
Oh, yeah.
She has a few properties that she didn't tell the British public about, yet they're paying for her very nice residence in Balmoral and other places. But for me, it's so interesting to see how now the active investigative journalism has to change, because in South Africa, we've got an elite investigative group of journalists who, when I said to you, they're Amapugani, and the other one is called the Scorpions, if I'm not mistaken.
I think the Daily Maverick also.
Yeah, the Daily Maverick has many exposés.
The Mail and Guardian, Becky Sisa.
And the Mail and Guardian as well. Yeah. And for me, that's where the new evolution has come, because apparently they're also recruiting other journalists to come into the fold because of the trillion and terabytes and terabytes of data that they've got to wade through, and the exposés, apparently the biggest leak in history.
Yes.
So, is this where the future of journalism is coming in now, that the digitization of documents and crime will now require that we become more forensic in our investigations as opposed to more investigative, or is it the same thing?
Well, I think all these digital tools, right? There's a lot of tools. There's crowd mapping, I think, for organizing and crunching data, right? And the guys at Code for Africa, I think that's an organization that's set up specifically to do this, to do digital investigations. Yeah. So I'm currently working on one with there's this German paper FAS, right? And Code for Africa. So what we're doing is we're tracking digitally the bronzes that were taken from the old Benin Empire in Nigeria in 1897, right? So this is just one example, right? And as more and more newsrooms, right, there's a whole lot more virtual newsrooms that are opening up because, hey, journalists have to travel. Yeah. You need freelancers in different regions, right? Someone who knows cultural background, who can get you an interview fast. I would need a South African journalist to get an interview with, say, Tuli Madonsela or someone like that, So digital newsrooms are, and because, of course, we know that the government is the surveillance on traditional means of communication. They're now now encrypted forms of emailing. I think I can't remember the names right, but the Washington Post in particular is using that a lot, especially in its reportage of the White House and on Trump, right? So staff is leaking, and in a way that also addresses the fact that when the government begins to continue to shackle the press or claim that news is fake news, people within it are still going to help, So it's almost like what you call it now? There's something in the Bible about a man's enemies are within his own household, or something like that.
In this case, the man's enemies are within the White House.
Yes. So eventually, the people are going to realize that there's an impact on even those of us in the White House, because even if you don't, let's say you live in a fine house with electricity and everything, you have people in the village, right? So the black tax is there, right? So digitizing newsrooms is generally going to have a much wider impact than we can tell, and this is going to continue in the future. There's going to be more. I think there's a camera right now that has Wi-Fi, for people who are on the field, right? And then you can take a picture and snap it in crisis zone, right? So you break news even faster than.
But then what does that do to the integrity of the journalism itself? Because I mean, we know there's the huge thing about wanting to get the story out first, and you've worked with the huge publications. I mean, if you think about like the Washington Post, if you think about like Forbes Africa with the Mail and Guardian being a very sort of traditional media and very trusted media. When you want a story, either go to the New York Times, the Washington Post, you go to the Mail and Guardian in South Africa, you go to the Business Day, the Star. You've got those titles that you get into. But at the very same place, we need to now start worrying about, while print is still part of the traditional media, everyone wants to break the story first. And that brings its own issues, because you don't have the triple verification that publishing houses should have, because you're now sitting there with, I cannot be waiting for you to go back to the office and double check if Leroy indeed is smuggling cocaine. He was holding a white bag, it was in his bag, he looked a bit dizzy, therefore he is a cocaine. You know what I mean? And so what do we do about the pitfalls around it? Because with these big, very integrity-ridden publications, any reputational damage to them would probably sink them.
So the thing is that working cross-border, right? Using digital tools means that there's an extra pair of eyes that's cross-checking your work for you. There's so for example, there's Africa Check, which is also in South Africa at the University of the Wits, right? And what has happened is that Africa Check kind of does desk research, right? But it has people in different countries where that it corroborates these facts with, and so what happens is that some of these platforms work in tandem with Africa Check, right? So that because one, you need to get the facts right. You're trying to blame, put the blame on the government, right? But you need to do that the right way with the proper facts and everything, right? So they work in tandem with people like Africa Check and Code for Africa, like I said. So for example, I have this financial statement, and I'm saying, hey, this bank is hiding something. I didn't know it, right? So we give to Code for Africa. So while our own business reporters are crunching the data, we give to Code for Africa that's more sophisticated, for example. So there's another pair of eyes, that's working. It's something like that, and all of these working with all the little checks that platforms have in place. Like Mail and Guardian, for example, has these forms where constant forms. Every single person you interview, even if they're not writing their real name, right? There has to be a signature, right? And some have you turn in the transcripts, like audio transcripts. Because we are realizing how things can easily be manipulated, right? I think there's like people can just, especially with crisis, right? There's beheading of like 200 people here, and then someone lifts a photo from Iraq or Yemen, 1962, and then applies it, and then takes it for something in Somalia, right? So all of these, so I could just send a picture right now to Code for Africa, and if I don't have the requisite tool, and then they do that while I'm doing my background check. Was there any eyewitness at the scene? So they are crunching the numbers and checking whether that picture is correct. So there's all this seamless cooperation and what you call it now, collaboration, using these digital techniques, because that integrity is really, really important, right? So if the traditional media houses don't have it themselves, they can collaborate with partners like this. In Nigeria, there's also budgets, right? So budgets, they do a lot of fiscal transparency work, right? So they take the budget and $20 billion is missing, for example, and they need to show the people that, this $20 billion could have built so number of hospitals, could have built so.
That is so interesting to say that, because we were saying, and I was saying this about 2 days ago, that when we now talk about the same family you're talking about earlier on, that we no longer steal $1 million, we steal $1 billion, right? So how do we then get people to have, as journalists, we understand that the fiscal budget is R1 trillion, or
but people just see it as
yeah.
number.
Another billion, it's gone, but there's more billions because we hear our finance minister speaking about, we have our fiscal budget this year is R1 trillion, but when you realize that R1 trillion is 1,000 billion, and 20 of those billions have gone missing in
that's some perspective
in 45 and now you start saying to me R1 billion would have built you 30, 40, 50, 60 schools, 6 hospitals, 4 airports, then it starts distilling in it. And when I come back, I want to chat to you about also the idea of the idiosyncrasies of having these kind of evolutions happening in the regions, because for instance Kenya has a more rapid data and
green tech scene. Very, very rapid,
very, very rapid compared to South Africa,
that's why they have Ushahidi. Right.
And we're sitting here, we claim we have very good internet, but it costs almost $1 billion to send a WhatsApp message these days because data is so expensive here. So that and much more about #ManTalk guests. Continue the conversation with us _Leroy _Marc at TransAfrica872 on Twitter, and of course I'm taking your WhatsApp +27 79 25 44329. It is #ManTalk #ManTalk Saturdays. Let's get a glass of water, shall we?
This is TransAfrica Radio.
Gardiner Kai coming through with a EJ on TransAfrica Radio, taking us to 5 minutes past the hour of 7 p.m. Central African Time. News, reviews, and interviews, and everything you've come to expect this side of the equator. At TransAfrica872 is where I'm at. OpenView HD 609 or DSTV 872. That's where we're at. And of course, in your pocket on tierradio.mobi. I am Leroy Marc with you for the next hour. And of course, in studio, I'm joined by my #ManTalk guest, Eromo.
Yeah, you're trying.
I'm getting there. Come on.
Just keep the effort. Keep up with the effort.
By the end of the show, and as you leave here, I'll be like, Eromo. I'll be like, oh, damn. Now he's gone. I've got the name right. But we've been having a very interesting conversation about the whole idea of journalism and how the digital landscape has lent itself to sort of expounding the journalistic integrity and the tentacles of journalism. But for me, let's go back a step. We're sitting in a continent that is very, very, the disparities in the countries, so intra-country and between the countries are very, very different. You just need to go to Lagos, for instance, which is what people would think is the same as Johannesburg in South Africa, being the two central powers of the continent. And then you find yourself in two different worlds altogether. And then you go to Kenya, which has rapid digitization and, their online presence is ridiculous. And then you find yourself in Ethiopia where WhatsApp doesn't work. So how does the regions themselves then work themselves out? Because remember, we've got all these globular nations that work together in all the other regions. So for instance, we have the European Union minus Brexit, and we have the United States, which is a continent on its own really, and then you've got the fringes, the smaller countries that are trying to get themselves together, and of course in the Eastern blockade and Asia, sort of an embargo on some areas of social media. But it's such a weird mix on the continent because we have sort of free press down here, and then literally
Burundi, for example. So I think reporting, right? Just and this is a huge problem with the West's approach, right?
Yeah.
They take Africa as a country, right?
Yeah.
I think there needs to be nuanced reporting, right? Sometimes it helps to group regions together, for easier reporting. But even then, right? These regions are heterogeneous. Nigeria, for example, you can't report on the north the same way you report on the south.
Yeah.
And then there's people think, the north is Muslim and the south, but that's not true, right? Even within these places, there are pockets and pockets of people. So reporting them has to, you have to streamline these people, like on ground, and have on ground reporters instead of having someone in Dakar doing phone calls to cover the rest of Africa, right? Even in West Africa, for example, right? There's English speaking and then there's French speaking countries, right? So it's important, right, to have digital techniques, that can help, even if you can't be on ground, right, to get the full detail, to have digital techniques that can help you find someone there who has the cultural understanding of, how these things work. I'll give a small example. The New York Times, which is one of the biggest offenders. So the New York Times wants to come photograph someone in what now, in Kanla, with just a Zuma. So instead of using a photographer, a South African photographer who's probably near one of the cities around, right? They fly someone from the US, right? And so you want to take pictures, but you don't even know the cultural background. Can I take pictures, with what you call it now. So in northern Nigeria, for example, you can't take pictures of people with hijabs, right?
Yeah.
At certain times of the day,
Yeah.
whether during Ramadan. So there might be cultures like that in this thing, you know. But these photographers who are local photographers would know, right?
Yeah.
So it would be better to have some of digital techniques that can help you find people on ground.
I appreciate the you know how you highlight the nuance, because for me that's what I find lacking usually even as a South African, because you know we have this very weird insulation that we have, that we are apart from Africa, yet you know.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah.
You know, so it's important to take the continent apart and report directly in one place and not as a whole, right? Granted, it's a united is it?
Yeah.
You know, it's a big continent, right? But you can't report on it as a country. Oh, statistics have shown that Africa's blah 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 blah. You know, but it's the domestic violence might be what you call it now. Might be more in some parts of the country, might be more, you know, some others. You know, they're struggling democracies, but there's also, you know, brilliant ones like in Botswana and Ghana as well. Yeah. Right. You know, so you know these things have to be nuanced, right? Not everything is black or white.
What do we say then about you know the wave then of change that has to come with it? Because for me, it's interesting to see that with the regions the way they set up, you would think that there'd be like, you know, we have an Arab Spring, and the big hoodie right now is that what's happening in Zimbabwe right now. I call it a pseudo coup because I think, you know,
it's a proper coup. Just, you know,
I think it's just too delicate. I mean, I feel like
the Zimbabwean officials apparently had meetings with China and some other people, you know, and so, you know, a few weeks ago, it was in Africa Confidential. Yeah. So a few weeks ago, right, and so there, you know, I think there were negotiations. Oh, you know, let's not disturb the polity. You know, let it be a stable transition.
Can I tell you why I have an issue with it? With why I call it pseudo coup and another a political
because Mugabe came out in public during the coup.
Baby boy went through.
That was
and I'm a very big fan of Karima Brown as a political analyst in this country, and she was saying that, you know, some parts of it also, I don't know, I just can't help feel that it is sort of too staged, and by stage I mean it's almost too theatrical, in that we've learned that, you know, SADC, useless. African Union, useless. I've been called out on the show for saying that, and I'll repeat it, useless. Because I've yet to see, here we sit in SADC, and people are more worried about what the wave of a proper coup would be, and I use inverted commas, you know, of full military force and might, and we don't want that to happen at all. It's not something I'm looking forward to. It's something I'm advocating for, but my issue is that it seems that it doesn't have the impact it requires to have for real change to be effected. But let's put that aside for a second, and you look at the region like SADC, right? And SADC is all in arms right now because after Mugabe it might be Jacob Zuma and God knows where else next. But there doesn't seem to be a united front, and also a wave that will deal with it, because you find somewhere like Kenya, snap bang in Africa, that's, you know, doing well economically. It's doing fairly well as far as, you know, data and the indices go, and then you just move slightly down and you've got the CAR, and that's going through the absolute most right now. And then you move down South Africa and we're chilling quite nice, but 200 kilometers up the road in Zimbabwe things are going down. Then you turn left a bit and Namibia is chilling. You know, there's such a weird mix that even the regions themselves don't seem to have a communication going down there, whereas when we talk about something like an Arab Spring, the region itself seemed to be going through some sort of evolution. What do we do to then start the conversation snowballing? Because, for instance, it's crazy for me that in South Africa it is legal to be in a same-sex marriage, but you go to Malawi, you go to even Tanzania and Ethiopia, where I was, where it is.
I think the regions, for example, in SADC, right? South Africa is the powerhouse, right? I think that in a way, right, these places are heterogeneous, right? So South Africa is experiencing relative peace, right? In most parts, there's probably a crisis in one part of South Africa right now. You know, so that kind of trickles down into, some country in the region, and then because this is a powerhouse, it means that some of the smaller nations around have to suffer, right? Either in reporting and governance, it's a whole large scale effect thing, right? But generally, on the whole, right, SADC is mostly peaceful, right? And even there's a kind of trend in West Africa, for example. There's now relatively peaceful democracy. You see what happened in Gambia, see Nigerian transition, see Ghana, see where else as well. I think Senegal a few years ago after
3 years ago. Yeah.
You know, so we can see that yes, there's a pattern, right, in each region. In like you mentioned, the Arab Spring, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, right. There's a particular emerging order, but still it's still necessary to bring in the nuances because, like you said, Namibia is chilling. Not everything is as generalized as it seems. As you know, there's shades of grey, and all of these have to be integrated into reporting. And there was something else I was going to say in relation to part of your question that I've forgotten. Can you?
I rambled on.
Your question was your question was long, but I had the answer initially. But generally,
well, it's a wave. I think it's about moving the wave down. What do we do to start the wave moving down? Because I said, for instance, in South Africa, we have same-sex couples can get married, but it's in Malawi. No.
So what I was going to say to that was that these powerhouses, and that's why I mentioned the powerhouses. These powerhouses have to now try and encourage some sort of policy change. Like maybe take some more active participation in this politics. For example, see Nigeria and Ghana, ensure that the Gambian change, the Jammeh handed over, right? Nigeria has over time helps in ECOMOG and Sierra Leone. But
don't you find it really weird? Because I mean, we're sitting here, for instance, with I go back to Zimbabwe because it's more proximate to us, where we had Grace Mugabe go and listen in a literal abuse of power. She
in South Africa.
Yeah, she hit a young lady with an extension cord, and for legal purposes, I must say allegedly, but really. And then we had Omar al-Bashir fly into the country and completely massacre international law because he's a wanted man, and yet our South African countries...
So that's the thing about the powerhouse, right? The AU also needs to stamp its foot down. This is what we're doing. I mean, the AU must have a lot of plans in the pipeline, but we aren't seeing any of this being implemented. Like in the public, this isn't trickling down to the people. So powerhouses, for example, if South Africa decided to, we're going to sanction Zimbabwe, or let's have bilateral talks about same-sex marriages and all these land rights issues, right? It'll be easier for there's a relationship between both countries, so it's easier that way than to have
but how do you as a region then, and from a journalistic point of view, how do you then force the governments to have the conversations that they're clearly not wanting to have? Because, for instance, if we use Omar al-Bashir, it was a complete, the stories they brought out were ridiculous. No, we have to get rid of him, he has to leave, we couldn't do that, and it's an option. International law is not necessarily binding, yet we did ratify the Roman statute. So
wasn't South Africa trying to get out of the ICC?
Yes, it was trying to get, but also, and that was right after the issue with Omar al-Bashir, because we were saying to you, well, we can put sanctions against you. The rest of the free world can put sanctions against you because you have signed onto a treaty, and the world is expecting you to do certain things, and yet you then give a head of state's wife diplomatic immunity, where actually in the strict reading of the legislation, as she's not a member of parliament, she's not a diplomat, she just happens to be married to one, and she's a first lady. So what do we do about that? So what do we do as journalists to say, okay, here's a united front? Because I think, and I put it to you, that as journalists you should have the relationship that you're saying that the country should have, where you have a UN or an AU of journalists to say to you, how do we bring the change that happened in South Africa to Namibia, to Zimbabwe, to wherever the region is?
So there's been a lot of so there's the IFJ, I think, International Federation of Journalists. There's doing some fellowships for journalists across these regions, and right now there's one that happens in Cape Town every year. LGBT reporting, right? So they're taking this story. A friend of mine is actually working on stuff in Nigeria. So they take journalists from these countries again because for nuanced reporting, right? So have journalists write on stories within that region, right? So and then the dominant media say is within that powerhouse, and then you write for it, and then it is syndicated across, and then there's constant pressure on the governments and on think tanks and parliaments, right? Because there's money funding these stories. So money gets channeled to the reporter. They write the research and investigate and write another story. So constant pressure, and then somewhere Amnesty International sees one of these stories and like, hey, and then they keep hitting on the statistics, and makes the government embarrassed. The government puts out a statement. Some guy lobbies in parliament, and
I can assure you, our government is beyond embarrassment. They are immune to embarrassment in every way.
But the thing is that when Amnesty International, some international, if it's local embarrassment, no. But some international, someone is going to put out a statement, right? And then somehow, someone in government is going to, come to his senses, and then people will start, even if it takes long, right? Yeah. There's going to be some policy change or something. I know. So she was one of my friend who walked with me into the studio was one of the people who advocated for a bill not too young to run. Yeah. Right. The age of running in Nigeria, there's a stipulated age, I think 35 or so.
Running.
Yes, running for office.
Oh, okay. Public office.
Yeah. So look at some other countries across the region. I think in Ghana, right, people can contest if you're in your early 20s or something like that, right? So in Nigeria, when they did that bill, the campaigns and all of that, right? Constant pressure, and then the bill passed, the first reading in Parliament, right? And that was because of constant pressure from Twitter. This wasn't even a case of journalists per se. Yeah, right? This is a case of young people saying, hey, we need to also take charge of our destiny, right? Look at other countries. In the US, for example, there's 19-year-olds getting to be representatives. Yeah. So this was something that was sustained. This was young people. So in cases like this where this time they use their own resources. But in cases where where you say you have consortium of journalists, now funding these stories, so in tandem with say Code for Africa, they do stories, highlighting statistics, having infographics, somebody's going to be embarrassed somewhere. And like I said, international thinkers will pick on it. Maybe the US embassy like, we're sanctioning, reducing number of people who are coming from number of people who, if you have a sex offender or child abuse record, you won't go. When that happens to one influential politician, right? People are going to, people in government are going to start looking inwards.
So it becomes sort of a systematic exposure of what's happening on the ground through those channels. When you come back on a chat about the visit that you're here on, so you're at my alma mater at attending the Global Investigative Journalism Conference. Was it like bodyguards and stuff for you guys down there?
No.
They have guns or anything.
We know how to stay invisible.
He actually isn't in the studio. He's actually in Lagos, Nigeria right now. For all you know, this is my hashtag Man Talk guest in the studio. We're going to the conversation all the way to 7:30 Central African time. And on the other side of that, we chat about what's happened in the news for the past week. But right now, let's talk about Shikana.
This is Trans Africa Radio.